after I finish these 2 reading series, I think I'm going to take a break from reading series, as I mentioned. It's hard to say how long my hiatus will last. It might be permanent. These might be my last reading series. If you would like to see more of this style of content, of course, I'm always open to feedback, and I'm all ears. But yeah, if you would like for me to continue with these reading series, let me know. Absolutely. Alright, let's see. Looks like I'm going to have difficulty with YouTube again this time. Probably at the end of the week I'm going to have to go in and see what made it and what didn't. But yeah, YouTube is where you should be able to find all my videos. Yeah, YouTube's going to be giving me a hard time, looks like. Alright, that's fine. Just gotta remember to go in and delete the scheduled video when it happens. But yeah, it looks like Twitch is working, so go on Twitch. YouTube streaming be damned. And for some reason I can't get my video to work with YouTube streaming. I don't know what the deal is on that. I keep setting the camera to my Lenovo camera, and for whatever reason YouTube simply cannot recognize it for whatever reason. So, yeah, if you go to my YouTube channel, Stormer Show, and all these reading series have no video, that's why. Because for some reason YouTube streaming is not configured properly, and I don't have the patience to like go in there and troubleshoot for half an hour. But anyway, Twitch doesn't have that problem, so there you go. Chapter 6. Last time Sverdlov, we learned, was, like, up until this point, Sverdlov seemed like he was a, like, maybe womanizing type character, but other than that, he seemed like somewhat of a good guy. He came to the rescue of Sonia and her family after their mother died. And in the last chapter, it kind of was somewhat of a revelation about Sverdlov's character. Like, we learned that he was eavesdropping on Raskolnikov's conversation with Sonia, and he uses that to try to blackmail, in a way, Raskolnikov's sister Dunya into having sex with him. And yeah, luckily she's able to get out of there before she gets raped or anything like that, but it looks like, you know, based on what he was doing, that's what he was trying to do. Like, the door was locked. And yeah, at the end of the last chapter, he took the revolver that she had. She fired at him twice. She missed both times. and he put it in his pocket, still with the shot still inside. So he has at least one shot revolver in his pocket that was Dunya's. Or I think originally Marfa's. Okay, chapter 6. He spent that evening till 10 o'clock going up from one low haunt to another. And this is another book where towards the end, it's 91% through. So we should be done with this book, I'm thinking, in a week, maybe two. Katia too turned up and sang another gutter song, how a certain villain and tyrant began kissing Katia. Sverdlov, I think Katia was the girl in the bar that Sverdlov bought a drink for, I think, if I recall correctly. Like he gave her a drink or something. Sverdlov treated Katia and the organ grinder and some singers and the waiters and two little clerks. He was particularly drawn to these clerks by the fact that they both had crooked noses, one bent to the left and the other to the right. They took him finally to a pleasure garden where he paid for their entrance. There was one lanky 3-year-old pine tree and three bushes in the garden, besides a Vauxhall, which was in reality a drinking bar where tea too was served, and there were a few green tables and chairs standing around it. A chorus of wretched singers and a drunken but exceedingly depressed German clown from Munich with a red nose entertained the public. The clerks quarreled with some other clerks, and a fight seemed imminent. Sverdlov was chosen to decide the dispute. He listened to them for a quarter of an hour, but they shouted so loud that there was no possibility of understanding them. The only fact that seemed certain was that one of them had stolen something and had even succeeded in selling it on the spot to a Jew, but would not share the spoil with his companion. Finally, it appeared that the stolen object was a teaspoon belonging to the Vauxhall. It was missed, and the affair began to seem troublesome. Sverdlov paid for the spoon, got up, and walked out of the garden. It was about 6 o'clock. He had not drunk a drop of wine all this time, and had ordered tea more for the sake of appearances than anything. He also cannot handle his booze, as he found out. He gets, extremely tipsy after just a glass of wine, so we will call him a teetotaler. It was a dark and stifling evening. He's like, oh, it's going to my head. It was a dark and stifling evening. Threatening storm clouds came over the sky about 10 o'clock. There was a clap of thunder, and the rain came down like a waterfall. The water fell 9 drops, but beat on earth in streams. There were flashes of lightning every minute, and each flash lasted while one could count 5. Drenched to the skin, he went home, locked himself in, opened the bureau, took out all his money and tore up 2 or 3 papers. Then, putting his money in his pocket, he was about to change his clothes, but looking out the window and listening to the thunder and rain, he gave up the idea, took up his hat, and went out of the room without locking the door. He went straight to Sonia. She was at home. She was not alone. The 4 Kapernamov children were with her. She was giving them tea. She received Sverdlov in a respectful silence, looking wonderingly at his soaking clothes. The children all ran away at once in indescribable terror. I think Kapernamov is the landlady, if I remember right. These aren't her brothers and sisters, I think. Because if that were the case, they'd be the Semyonoviches, I think. Okay. Or Marmeladovs. One of the two. Sverdlov sat down at the table and asked Sonia to sit beside him. She timidly prepared to listen. What is with Sonia and attracting villains? First it was Raskolnikov, then it was Luzhin, then now it's Sverdlov. She's just surrounded by the worst possible men at all times. I may be going to America, Sofia Semyonovna, said Sverdlov, and as I am probably seeing you for the last time, I have come to make some arrangements. Well, did you see the lady today? I know what she said to you. You need not tell me. Sonia made a movement and blushed. Dunya wanted to see her to confirm what he was saying about Raskolnikov being a murderer. Those people have their own way of doing things. As to your sisters and your brother, they are really provided for, and the money assigned to them I put into safekeeping and have received acknowledgments. You'd better take charge of the receipts, in case anything happens. Here, take them. Well, now that's settled. Here are 5% bonds to the value of 3,000 rubles. Take those for yourself, entirely for yourself, and let that be strictly between ourselves, so that no one knows of it. Whatever you hear, you will need the money, for to go on living in the old way, Sofia Semyonovna, is bad. And besides, there is no need for it now. Like, sometimes he does good things. Sverdlov, to separate him from Luzhin in some way. I am so much indebted to you, and so are the children and my stepmother, said Sonia hurriedly. And if I've said so little, please don't consider... That's enough. But as for the money, Arkady Ivanovich, I'm very grateful to you, but I don't need it now. I can always earn my own living. Don't think me ungrateful. If I were her, well, she might still be, like, cautious based on her run with Luzhin. Right? Bad things will tend to happen when guys offer her money. If you're so charitable, that money, it's for you, Sophie. Like, there's always strings attached. It's for you, Sofia Semyonovna, and please don't waste words over it. I haven't time for it. You still want it. Rodion Romanovich has two alternatives. A bullet in the brain or Siberia. Sonia looked wildly at him and started. Don't be uneasy. I know all about it from himself, and I am not a gossip. I won't tell anyone. It was good advice when you told him to give himself up and confess. It would be much better for him. Well, if it turns out to be Siberia, he will go and you will follow him. That's so, isn't it? And if so, you'll need money. You'll need it for him, do you understand? Giving it to you is the same as my giving it to him. Besides, you promised Amelia Ivanovna to pay what's owing. I heard you. How can you undertake such obligations so heedlessly, Sofia Semyonovna? It was Katerina Ivanovna's debt and not yours. Amelia Ivanovna's the landlady. Katerina Ivanovna's her mom. Kind of confusing since she has a different last name. Yeah, I don't know why that is. So you ought not to have taken notice of the German woman. You can't get through the world like that. If you are ever questioned about me tomorrow or the day after, you'll be asked. Don't say anything about my coming to see you now. Don't show the money to anyone or say a word about it. Well, now, goodbye. He got up. My greetings to Rodion Romanovich. By the way, you better put the money for a present in Mr. Razmahin's keeping. You know Mr. Razmahin. Of course you do. He's not a bad fellow. Take it to him tomorrow, or when the time comes. Till then, hide it carefully. Yeah, Razmahin's probably the most noble male character in this book. Sonia too jumped up from her chair and looked in dismay at Sverdlov. She longed to speak, to ask a question, but for the first moment she did not dare and did not know how to begin. How can you be going now in such rain? Why, be starting for America. Be stopped by rain? Haha. Goodbye, Sofia Semyonovna, my dear. Live and live long. You will be of use to others. By the way, tell Mr. Razmahin I send my greetings to him. Tell him Arkady Ivanovich Sverdlov sends his greetings. Be sure to. He went out, leaving Sonia in a state of wondering anxiety and vague apprehension. She's like, what's he after? It appeared afterwards that on the same evening at 11:20, he made another very eccentric and unexpected visit. The rain still persisted. Drenched to the skin, he walked into the little flat where the parents of his betrothed live, in 3rd Street, in Vasilyevsky Island. Yeah, he was saying he was destined to be married to someone other than Dunya, but it looks like, based on the events of last chapter, he wasn't... That's not who he was really after. Yeah, hard to say what the significance of this relationship really is. He knocked some time before he was admitted, and his visit at first caused great perturbation. Sverdlov could be very fascinating when he liked, so the first and indeed very intelligent surmise of the sensible parents that Sverdlov had probably had so much to drink that he did not know what he was doing vanished immediately. The decrepit father was wheeled in to see Sverdlov by the tender and sensible mother, who as usual began the conversation with various irrelevant questions. She never asked a direct question, but began by smiling and rubbing her hands, and then, if she were obliged to ascertain something, for instance, when Sverdlov would like to have the wedding, she would begin by interested and almost eager questions about Paris and the court life there, and only by degrees brought the conversation round to 3rd Street. On other occasions this had of course been very impressive, but this time Arkady Ivanovich seemed particularly impatient, insisted on seeing his betrothed at once, though he had been informed to begin with that she had already gone to bed. The girl of course appeared. Sverdlov informed her at once that he was obliged by very important affairs to leave Petersburg for a time, therefore brought her 15,000 rubles and begged her to accept them as a present from him, as he had long been intending to make her this trifling present before their wedding. The logical connection of the present with his immediate departure and the absolute necessity of visiting them for that purpose in pouring rain at midnight was not made clear, but it all went off very well. Even the inevitable ejaculations of wonder and regret, the inevitable questions, were extraordinarily few and restrained. On the other hand, the gratitude expressed was most glowing, and was reinforced by tears from the most sensible of mothers. Sverdlov got up, laughed, kissed his betrothed, patted her cheek, declared he would soon come back, and noticing her eyes, together with childish curiosity, a sort of earnest dumb inquiry, reflected and kissed her again, though he felt such sincere anger inwardly at the thought that his present would be immediately locked up in the keeping of the most sensible mothers. He went away, leaving them all in a state of extraordinary excitement, but the tender mamma, speaking quietly in a half-whisper, settled some of the most important of their doubts, concluding that Sverdlov was a man of great affairs and connections and of great wealth. There is no knowing what he had in his mind. He would start off on a journey and give away money just as the fancy took him, so that there was nothing surprising about it. Of course, it was strange that he was wet, though. That's usually what happens when it rains. But Englishmen, for instance, are even more eccentric. And all these people of high society didn't think of what was said of them and didn't stand on ceremony. Possibly, indeed, he came like that on purpose to show that he was not afraid of anyone. But of all, not a word should be said about it, for God knows what might come of it, and the money must be locked up, and it was most fortunate that Fedosia, the cook, had not left the kitchen. Above all, not a word must be said to that old cat, Madame Ruslich, so on and so on. He sat up whispering till 2 o'clock, but the girl went to bed much earlier, amazed and rather sorrowful. Sverdlov, meanwhile, exactly at midnight, crossed the bridge on the way back to the mainland. The rain had ceased and there was a roaring wind. He began shivering. For a moment he gazed at the black waters of the little Neva with a look of special interest, even inquiry. He soon felt it very cold, standing by the water, turned and went towards Wye Prospect. He walked along that endless street for a time, almost half an hour, more than once stumbling in the dark on the wooden pavement, but continually looking for something on the right side of the street. He had noticed passing through this street lately there was a hotel somewhere towards the end, built of wood, but fairly large, and its name he remembered was something like Adrianople. He was not mistaken. The hotel was so conspicuous in that godforsaken place that he could not fail to see it even in the dark. There was a long, blackened wooden building. In spite of the late hour, there were lights in the windows and signs of life within. He went in and asked for a ragged fellow who met him in the corridor for a room. The latter, scanning Sverdlov, pulled himself together and led him at once to a close and tiny room in the distance, at the end of the corridor, under the stairs. There was no other. All were occupied. The ragged fellow looked inquiringly. "Is there tea?" asked Sverdlov. "Yes, sir." "What else is there?" "Veal, vodka, savories. Bring me tea and veal." "You want nothing else?" he asked with apparent surprise. Nothing. The ragged man went away, completely disillusioned. It must be a nice place, thought Sverdlov. How was it I didn't know it? I expect I look as if I came from a cafe chantant and have had some adventure on the way. It would be interesting to know who stayed here. I think it should be stays. He lighted the candle and looked at the room more carefully. It was a room so low-pitched that Sverdlov could only just stand up in it. It had a window, the bed, which was very dirty, and the plain stained chair and table almost filled it up. The walls looked as though they were made of planks, covered with shabby paper, so torn and dusty that the pattern was indistinguishable, though the general color yellow could still be made out. One of the walls was cut short by the sloping ceiling, though the room was not an attic but under the stairs. Sverdlov set down the candle, sat down on the bed, and sank into thought. A strange, persistent murmur, which sometimes rose to a shout in the next room, attracted his attention. The murmur had not ceased from the moment he entered the room. He listened. Someone was upbraiding and almost tearfully scolding, but he heard only one voice. Sverdlov got up, shaded the light with his hand, and at once he saw light through a crack in the wall. He went up and peeped through. He does have a tendency to eavesdrop, Sverdlov. The room, which was somewhat larger than his, had two occupants. One of them, a very curly-headed man with a red inflamed face, was standing in the pose of an orator, without his coat, with his legs wide apart to preserve his balance, smiting himself on the breast. He reproached the other with being a beggar, with having no standing whatever. He declared that he had taken the other out of the gutter and he could turn him out when he liked. Not only the finger of providences at all. The object of his reproaches was sitting in a chair, had the air of a man who wants dreadfully to sneeze but can't. He sometimes turned sheepish and befogged eyes on the speaker, but obviously had not the slightest idea what he was talking about and scarcely heard it. Candle was burning down on the table. There were wine glasses, a nearly empty bottle of vodka, bread and cucumber, glasses with the dregs of stale tea. After gazing attentively at this, Sverdlov turned away indifferently and sat down on the bed. The ragged attendant, returning with the tea, could not resist asking him again whether he didn't want anything more, and again receiving a negative reply, finally withdrew. Sverdlov made haste to drink a glass of tea to warm himself, but could not eat anything. He began to feel feverish. He took off his coat and, wrapping himself in the blanket, lay down on the bed. He was annoyed. It would have been better to be well for the occasion, he thought with a smile. The room was close, the candle burnt timidly. The wind was roaring outside. He heard a mouse scratching in the corner, and the room smelt of mice and of leather. He lay in a sort of reverie. One thought followed another. He felt a longing to fix his imagination on something. It must be a garden under the window, he thought. There's a sound of trees. How I dislike the sound of trees on a stormy night in the dark. They give one a horrid feeling. He remembered how he had disliked it when he passed Petrovsky Park just now. This reminded him of the bridge over the Little Neva, and he felt cold again as he had when he was standing there. I never have liked water, he thought, even in the landscape. And he suddenly smiled again at a strange idea. Surely now all these questions of taste and comfort ought not to matter, but I've become more particular, like an animal that picks out a special place for such an occasion. I ought to have gone into Petrovsky Park. I suppose it seemed dark, cold, as though I were seeking pleasant sensations. By the way, why haven't I put out the candle? He blew it out. They'd gone to bed next door, he thought, not seeing the light at the crack. Well now, Marfa Petrovna, now it's time for you to turn up. It's dark. The very time and place for you, but now you won't come. That's because ghosts are not real. Sverdlov. He suddenly recalled how, an hour before carrying out his design on Dunya, he had recommended Raskolnikov to trust her to Razumin's keeping. I suppose I really did say it, as Raskolnikov guessed, to tease myself. What a rogue that Raskolnikov is. He's gone through a good deal. He may be a successful rogue in time when he's got over his nonsense, but now he's too eager for life. These young men are contemptible in that point. But hang the fellow, let him please himself, it's nothing to do with me. He could not get to sleep. By degrees, Dunya's image rose before him, and a shudder ran over him. No, I must give all that up now. He thought, rousing himself. I must think of something else. It's queer and funny. I never had a great hatred for anyone. I never particularly desired to avenge myself even. And that's a bad sign, a bad sign, a bad sign. I never liked quarreling either. Never lost my temper. That's a bad sign too. The promises I made her just now too. Damnation. But who knows? Perhaps she would have made a new man of me somehow. He ground his teeth and sank into silence again. Again, Dunya's image rose before him, just as she was when, after shooting the first time, she had lowered the revolver in terror and gazed blankly at him, so that he might have seized her twice over. She would not have lifted a hand to defend herself if he had not reminded her. He recalled how at that instant he felt almost sorry for her, how he felt a pang at his heart. Damnation, these thoughts again. I must put it away. He was dozing off. The feverish shiver had ceased. And suddenly something seemed to run over his arm and leg under the bedclothes. He started. Ugh, hang it. I believe it's a mouse. Thought, that's the villa left on the table. He felt fearfully disinclined to pull off the blanket, get up, get cold, but all at once something unpleasant ran over his leg again. He pulled off the blanket and lighted the candle. Shaking with feverish chill, he bent down to examine the bed. There was nothing. He shook the blanket, and suddenly a mouse jumped out on the sheet. He tried to catch it, but the mouse ran to and fro in zigzags without leaving the bed. Slipped between his fingers, ran over his hand, and suddenly darted under the pillow. He threw down the pillow, but in one instant felt something leap on his chest and dart over his body, down his back and under his shirt. He trembled nervously and woke up. He never actually fell asleep. The room was dark. He was lying on the bed and wrapped up in the blanket as before. The wind was howling under the window. How disgusting, he thought with annoyance. He got up and sat on the edge of the bedstead with his back to the window. You can't have lucid thoughts when you're dreaming. Which is why I say he wasn't asleep. I guess some would say it's possible if you're lucid dreaming, but I don't think he is, or was. The room was dark. He was lying on the bed and wrapped up in the blanket as before. The wind was howling under the window. How disgusting, he thought with annoyance. He got up and sat on the edge of the bedstead with his back to the window. It's better not to sleep at all, he decided. There was a cold, damp draught from the window, however. Without getting up, he drew the blanket over him and wrapped himself in it. He was not thinking of anything and did not want to think. But one image rose after another. Incoherent scraps of thought, without beginning or end, passed through his mind. He sank into drowsiness. Perhaps the cold or the dampness or the dark, or the wind that howled under the window and tossed the trees, roused a sort of persistent craving for the fantastic. He kept dwelling on images of flowers. He fancied a charming flower garden, a bright, warm, almost hot day, a holiday, Trinity Day. A fine, sumptuous country cottage in the English taste, overgrown with fragrant flowers, flower beds growing around the house. The porch, wreathed in climbers, was surrounded with beds of roses. A light, cool staircase, carpeted with rich rugs, was decorated with rare plants and china pots. He noticed particularly in the windows nosegays of tender, white, heavily fragrant narcissus bending over their bright green, thick, long stalks. He was reluctant to move away from them, but he went up the stairs and came into a large, high drawing room, again everywhere. At the windows, doors onto the balcony. On the balcony itself were flowers. The floors were strewn with freshly cut, fragrant hay. The windows were open. A fresh, cool light air came into the room. The birds were chirping under the window. And in the middle of the room, on a table covered with a white satin shroud, stood a coffin. The coffin was covered with white silk and edged with a thick white frill. Wreaths of flowers surrounded it on all sides. Among the flowers lay a girl in white muslin dress, with her arms crossed and pressed on her bosom, as though carved out of marble. This is in his hotel room, what is that doing there? But her loose, fair hair was wet. There was a wreath of roses on her head. The stern and already rigid profile of her face looked as though chiseled of marble, too. The smile on her pale lips was full of an immense, unchildish misery and sorrowful appeal. Unless he's hallucinating. Svridlov knew that girl. There was no holy image, no burning candle beside the coffin, no sound of prayers. The girl had drowned herself. She was only 14, but her heart was broken. She had destroyed herself, crushed by an insult that had appalled and amazed that childish soul, smirched that angel purity with unmerited disgrace, torn from her a last scream of despair, unheeded with brutally disregarded on a dark night in the cold and wet while the wind howled. Svridlov came to himself, got up from the bed and went to the window. He felt for the latch and opened it. The wind lashed furiously into the little room, stung his face and his chest, only covered with his shirt as though with frost. Under the window there must have been something like a garden, apparently a pleasure garden. There too probably there were tea tables and singing in the daytime. Now drops of rain flew in at the window from the trees and the bushes. It was dark as in a cellar, so that he could only just make out some dark blurs of objects. Svridlov, bending down with elbows on the windowsill, gazed for 5 minutes into the darkness. The boom of a cannon, followed by second ones, resounded the darkness of the night. The signal. The river's overflowing, he thought. By morning it will be swirling down the street in the lower parts, flooding the basements and cellars. The cellar rats will swim out, and men will curse in the rain and wind as they drag the rubbish to their upper stories. What time is it now? He had hardly thought about it when somewhere near a clock on the wall, ticking away hurriedly, struck 3. It will be light in an hour. Why wait? I'll go out at once to the park. I'll choose a great bush. there drenched with rain, so that as soon as one's shoulder touches it, millions of drops drip on one's head. He moved away from the window, shut it, lighted the candle, put on his waistcoat, his overcoat, and his hat, and went out carrying the candle into the passage to look for the ragged attendant who would be asleep somewhere in the midst of candle ends and all sorts of rubbish to pay him for the room and leave the hotel. It's the best minute. I couldn't choose better. He walked for some time through a long, narrow corridor without finding anyone and was just about to call out. But suddenly, in a dark corner between an old cupboard and the door, he caught sight of a strange object which seemed to be alive. He bent down with the candle and saw a little girl, not more than 5 years old, shivering and crying, with her clothes as wet as a soaking house flannel. She did not seem afraid of Svrglav, but looked at him with blank amazement out of her big black eyes. Now and then she sobbed as children do when they have been crying a long time, but are beginning to be comforted. The child's face was pale and tired. She was numb with cold. How can she have come here? She must have hidden here and not slept all night. He began questioning her. The child, suddenly becoming animated, chattered away in her baby language. Something about Mammy and that Mammy would be her, and about some cup that she'd broken. The child chattered on without stopping. He can only guess from what she said that she was a neglected child, whose mother, probably a drunken cook, in the service of the hotel, whipped and frightened her. The child had broken a cup of her mother's and was so frightened that she had run away the evening before, had hidden for a long while somewhere outside in the rain. At last had made her way in here, hidden behind the cupboard, and spent the night there, crying and trembling from the damp, the darkness, and feared that she would be badly beaten for it. He took her in his arms, went back to his room, sat her on the bed, and began undressing her. The torn shoes which she had on her stockingless feet were as wet as if they had been standing in a puddle all night. When he had undressed her, he put her on the bed, covered her up, and wrapped her in the blanket from her head downwards. She fell asleep at once. Then he sank into dreary musing again. What folly to trouble myself, he decided suddenly with an oppressive feeling of annoyance. What idiocy. Vexation, he took up the candle to go and look for the ragged attendant again, make haste to go away. Damn the child, he thought as he opened the door, but he turned again to see whether the child was asleep. He raised the blanket carefully. The child was sleeping soundly. She got warm under the blanket, and her pale cheeks were flushed. Strange to say, flush seemed brighter and coarser than the rosy cheeks of childhood. It's a flush of fever, thought Svrglav. It was like the flush from drinking, as though she had been given a full glass to drink. Her crimson lips were hot and glowing. But what was this? He suddenly fancied that her long black eyelashes were quivering, as though the lids were opening and a sly, crafty eye peeped out with an unchildlike wink, as though the little girl were not asleep but pretending. Yes, it was so. Her lips parted in a smile. The corners of her mouth quivered as though she were trying to control them, but now she quite gave up all effort. Now it was a grin, a broad grin. There was something shameless, provocative in that quite unchildish face. It was depravity. It was the face of a harlot, the shameless face of a French harlot. But she's 5. I don't know. Both eyes open wide, they turned a glowing, shameless glance upon him. They laughed, invited him. There was something infinitely hideous and shocking in that laugh. In those eyes. Such nastiness in the face of a child. What, at 5 years old? Svrglav muttered in genuine horror. What does it mean? Now she turned to him, her little face all aglow, holding out her arms. Accursed child, Svrglav cried, raising his hand to strike her, but at that moment he woke up. He was in the same bed, still wrapped in the blanket. The candle had not been lighted, and daylight was streaming in at the windows. So it was all a dream. Salt and Pepper and Heavy D up in the limousine. Biggie Smalls reference in that. I've had nightmare all night. I think you mean nightmares? Or a nightmare? He got up angrily, feeling utterly shattered. His bones ached. There was a thick mist outside, and he could see nothing. It was nearly 5. He'd overslept himself. He'd overslept himself. He got up and put on his still damp jacket and overcoat. Feeling the revolver in his pocket, he took it out, and then he sat down, took a notebook out of his pocket, and in the most conspicuous place on the title page wrote a few lines in large letters. Reading them over, he sank into thought with his elbows on the table. The revolver and the notebook lay beside him. Some flies woke up and settled on the untouched veal, which was still on the table. He stared at them, and at last, with his free right hand, began trying to catch one. He tried until he was tired, but could not catch it. At last, realizing that he was engaged in this interesting pursuit, he started, got up, and walked resolutely out of the room. A minute later, he was in the street. A thick milky mist hung over the town. Svrgilov walked along the slippery, dirty wooden pavement towards the Little Neva. He was picturing the waters of the Little Neva swollen in the night, Petrovsky Island, the wet paths, the wet grass, the wet trees and bushes, and at last the bush. He began ill-humoredly staring at the houses, trying to think of something else. There was not a cabman or a passers-by in the street. The bright yellow wooden little houses looked dirty and dejected with their closed shutters. The cold and damp penetrated his whole body, and he began to shiver. From time to time he came across shop signs and read each carefully. At last he reached the end of the wooden pavement, came to a big stone house. A dirty, shivering dog crossed his path with its tail between his legs. A man in a greatcoat lay face downwards, dead drunk, across the pavement. Looked at him and went on. A high tower stood up on the left. Bah, he shouted, here's a place. Why should it be Petrovsky? It will be in the presence of an official witness anyway. He almost smiled at this new thought and turned into the street where there was a big house with a tower. At the great closed gates of the house, a little man stood with his shoulders leaning against them, wrapped in a gray soldier's coat with a copper Achilles helmet on his head. He cast a drowsy, indifferent glance at Svrgilov. His face wore that perpetual look of peevish dejection, which is so sourly printed on all faces of the Jewish race without exception. They both, Svrgilov and Achilles, stared at each other for a few minutes without speaking. At last it struck Achilles as irregular for a man not drunk to be standing 3 steps from him, staring and not saying a word. What do you want here? He said, without moving or changing his position. Nothing, brother. Good morning, answered Svrgilov. This isn't the place. I'm going to foreign parts, brother. To foreign parts? To America. America. Svrgilov took out the revolver and cocked it. And you're going with me. No. Achilles raised his eyebrows. I say, this is not the place for such jokes. Why shouldn't it be the place? Because it isn't. Well, brother, I don't mind that. It's a good place. When you're asked, you just say he was going, he said, to America. He put the revolver to his right temple. You can't do it here. It's not the place, cried Achilles, rousing himself, his eyes growing bigger and bigger. Svrgilov pulled the trigger. What? And now he's a murderer? Why? Yeah, I have no clue. I have absolutely no clue why Svrgilov would kill this guy. No clue at all. He's a soldier, so I don't know. Hopefully we'll figure out in chapter 7. Stay tuned for the next episode, Crime and Punishment.